working-level meeting between Seoul and Tokyo took place after Japan imposed export restrictions on South Korea on July 4th, but the soured relations between the two sides have yet to recover. The first working-level sit-down between South Korean and Japanese officials that took place on July 12th has ended without progress. The meeting, which ran for nearly 6 hours, has inflamed the spat as the two sides adamantly held on to their grounds and showed no signs of resolutions.
일측 조치의 원상 회복, 즉 철회를 요청했습니다.
撤回を求めたという明確な発言までは得られておりません。
Meanwhile, Japan, who accused South Korea of leaking sensitive industrial materials to North Korea, has reportedly turned out to be the one that exported strategic and luxury goods to North Korea. As the trade spat between the two countries continues to mount, other nations have responded to the developing matter. North Korea denounced Japan for placing the export curves, while top Cheongwade official Kim Yeon-jong said figures in Washington have deeply sympathized with Seoul's concern and said the ongoing conflict is impairing the trilateral cooperation. Meanwhile, the WTO has agreed to formally hear the arguments surrounding the trade dispute between South Korea and Japan during its General Council from July 23rd to 24th. Only time will tell how the trade spat would unfold, as it is slated to be discussed among other nations around the world.
Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm your host, Daniel Che. Japan's export curbs in South Korea triggered a diplomatic spat. South Korea is saying this is an unfair move. Japan is saying it's a matter of trust. This issue will be discussed by the international community. Today, we delve a little deeper into this topic. So, let's get to the point. To help us dissect the topic into digestible bites, we're joined in the studio again by Song Se-reum, Professor of Law from Kyung University. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
Well, the topic is, of course, the trade tension between South Korea and Japan. When officials of both sides met in Tokyo on July 12, the ambiance or the environment or the situation did not seem that friendly nor hospitable.
Right, if you look at the picture, it looks a little bit strange. It was an unusually low-level meeting to begin with, and it looked like our delegate was invited to what looked like a warehouse, a small warehouse room, and they looked very frigid in their stance. And it seemed like what they discussed even has not been really in course, meaning that the both sides are talking about different things even afterwards.
Right. How far were the two sides in terms of understanding the situation, the trade spat?
Well, Japan maintained from the get-go that this is not a negotiation, it's a briefing, but that briefing took about 5 hours, and a lot were discussed, and Korean delegation came away with the feeling that a lot of issues has been explained and debated with a lot of responses from Japan. But Japan maintained that the Korean delegation didn't even ask for the letting down the measure that Japan has taken. So it seems like they cannot agree on what was discussed, what was the topic, and what would be the next step.
The situation sounded like Japan was saying, I hear what you're saying, and the answer is no during that brisk meeting.
Right. I think there was a scenario that Japan would maintain that this is not subject to negotiation, and they will just maintain their stance regardless of what Korea says.
The two sides have also made contrasting claims about the withdrawal of Japan's export curbs. So let's take a look at a clip first.
철회 요청은 없었다라는 주장이 있는데 우리는 일측 조치에 대해서 유감 표명을 했고 일측 조치의 원상 회복, 즉 철회를 요청했습니다.
再度、会議録を確認したんですが、問題提起についてはあったんですが、撤回を求めたという明確な発言までは得られておりません。
What's intriguing is that there was a little bit of a twist. Japan was accusing South Korea of violating sanctions against North Korea, but Japan was actually the one that was found to be exporting prohibited items to the regime.
Right. The allegation about the involvement in North Korea, a lot of experts said that, including myself, that argument is useful for Japan if it is true, because you can have a trump card against any the WTO rules, because a country is entitled to take measures on the security thing. So I think it was exaggerated, if not manufactured, to make that security concern narratives, but it did not work well because they didn't really have the solid evidence backing that claim.
Well, meanwhile, President Moon Jae-in warned Japan that it will suffer bigger economic backlash should it keep the export curbs in place. These were his direct remarks from a weekly 청와대 meeting with his top aides on July 15th.
이번 일본의 수출 제한 조치는 상호 의존과 상호 공생으로 반세기간 축적해온 한일 경제 협력의 틀을 깨는 것입니다. 오히려 일본과의 제조업 분업 체계에 대한 신뢰를 깨뜨려 우리 기업들은 일본의 소재, 부품, 장비에 대한 의존에서 벗어나 수입처를 다변화하거나 국산화의 길을 걸어갈 것입니다. 결국에는 일본 경제에 더 큰 피해가 갈 것임을 경고해 둡니다.
Stating facts that it will hurt Japan in the long run, and we also talked about how South Korea will be preparing countermeasures against Japan's unfair retaliatory measures. This is what makes the coming WTO General Council a bigger deal. When the meeting is set to convene on July 23rd, the trade spat will be openly debated by the international community.
Right. The WTO process is kind of notoriously long and arduous procedure, but it has a big advantage that the global community is there to discuss this issue. So in that sense, this is a diplomatic route to alert the world that this unfair practice is happening. So if Korea can persuade others that the Japan is taking this measure not on economic terms, but to address their domestic or the diplomatic issues, probably it'll garner a lot of nodding heads from the world community. So in that sense, it's a battle for reputation, and I think that regardless of what happens in the WTO proceedings, Japan has a lot to lose.
Right, Japan has a lot to lose. Do you think the discussions to be held would benefit Korea greatly in terms of gaining a leverage or international support against Japan regarding the trade curbs?
Korea should have different avenues to address this issue. One is to talk directly, obviously, with Japan to iron out the differences. But the other issue is to have a global discussion about this, because the ramifications of two countries is the supply chain disruption and also negative impact on the global economy. So I think it's a fitting subject that a lot of countries look into this.
Well, zooming in on Japan now, it is showing no signs of drawing back the export curbs ahead of the WTO meeting. We'll continue to discuss after looking at this clip.
さらに今回の措置は韓国に対して実施してきた簡素化した手続きを通常の手続きに戻すものであり、WTO 協定とも整合的である旨説明をいたしました。今回の措置は WTO で認められている安全保障上のための輸出管理制度の適切な運用に必要な見直しであり、WTO 違反との指摘は全く当たらず、その撤回は考えておりません。
So Japan seems unfazed by this process of taking the matter to the General Council meeting. Could you perhaps break down to the viewers how the issue will be discussed at the WTO General Council?
Right. Procedurally, the WTO process starts with filing a complaint, and what it involves is sending a request for mutual consultation between the countries that are in dispute. So we'll be sending our request for consultation with Japan, and that process should be exhausted before there's impanelment in the WTO, 3-person impaneled, to look at this issue. And that process takes quite a long time, 6 months to 9 months. So after that, there will be an opinion, the kind of a verdict rendered by the panel. If the country that is affected kind of complies with it, then that's the end of it, because they will take the corrective measure. But if they appeal, then there is another period of time to look at have the appellate body to look at the issue. So overall, it takes more than a year. It's not unusual that it takes 2 to 3 years. So in that sense, it's a very long process procedurally. But I think substantively, Japan is pretty confident because of this kind of idiosyncrasy in the world politics, that if the country as a sovereign nation says that this is our concern, especially the security measures, then even if that argument is pretty thinly veiled, other countries cannot say, well, that is phony and you should not do that. So this diplomatic relations between the countries make it very hard to kind of dispel Japan's claim that they do think, if they insist, that there is a security concerns.
Well, before we dig deeper into this issue from our perspective, let's find out how other countries are perceiving this dispute. We have Stephen R. Nagy, professor from International Christian University, connected live via Skype to share his insights with us. Hello there.
Hello.
Well, the WTO will formally discuss whether it is fair for Japan to retaliate South Korea with the export curbs. What is the rest of the world's view on this dispute?
So when the world looks at the dispute between South Korea and Japan today, many are flummoxed by the downward spiral in bilateral relations, especially when we compare back when both countries jointly held a World Cup event, which was tremendously successful. We saw really thousands, tens of thousands of Japanese showing tremendous interest in South Korean culture and traveling to South Korea to learn more about South Korea and study South Korean language. And today we're at a very different place. Both sides are not speaking to each other. That was exemplified by the handshake and lack of a bilateral meeting at the G20 between Prime Minister Abe and President Moon. And now with the trade dispute, in which the Japanese have used the principle of national security to limit the import of sensitive substances into South Korea that are very important for South Korea's signature industries and conglomerates such as Samsung.
Professor Nagy, obviously Japan and Korea don't see eye to eye on this issue. What's your take on how it can produce and how it can be resolved?
Now, there's an open question of whether bringing this dispute to this World Trade Organization will be able to resolve the bilateral problem between South Korea and Japan. And at this stage, I don't think they'll be able to do that. The Japanese government has been very strategic in terms of how it has articulated its position of limiting the exports of these substances to South Korea. They've used the broad umbrella term of it's for national security interests, and they've made an argument, at least a narrative, that the downward spiral in relations with South Korea and Japan, the perceived view in Tokyo that South Korea has become an unreliable partner when it comes to bilateral negotiations and committing to bilateral agreements, has put the Japanese-South Korean relationship at risk, and that dealings with South Korea are potentially a national security risk. Now, this is a card out of the Trump playbook. President Trump did this with steel tariffs on many close neighbors and partners and long-term alliance partners. And I think that the Abe administration has looked at this as a successful strategy to be able to put pressure on South Korea to depoliticize some recent political events and begin to commit to those bilateral commitments that both parties agreed on.
Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. We appreciate it. Right, coming back to you, Professor Song, Japan wanted South Korea's response to its request on forming a panel of third country arbitrators to review the forced labor issue. But of course, South Korea's answer is no, and Japan seems bent on enforcing additional pressure or retaliatory measure against South Korea.
Right. The Korea's position on this is very consistent, and I think it's very reasonable because what the Korea is saying is that this was triggered, whole dispute was triggered by the decision of the Supreme Court on the individual claims. And if Japan wants the Korean government to interfere with the judiciary, then it goes against the separation of powers. And because of that, this is not a proper subject of the arbitration itself. So it's not just refusing to talk, but the Korea is making a credible argument that this subject matter itself is not subject to that discussion.
When Japan puts additional pressure with other retaliatory measures, do you think South Korea should perhaps take reciprocal actions against Tokyo?
Well, that's a very sensitive subject. Japan already said numerous times that they will take additional measures, but a lot of experts have been saying that Abe's action is kind of a domestic purpose to it. The election is coming up. His desire to change the constitution is paramount in his campaign the narratives. So in that sense, he needs to kind of rally his base. So if that's the purpose, then taking a reciprocal action on the part of Korea would be to address what is not really the subject matter. I think that if what Japan is doing is not very helpful to global economy because it hurts the supply chain and the economic world order at this point, then Korea should not join it. Korea should not really stoop to that level, so to speak. So in that sense, I think that Korea should be very careful about how they address this issue. I think that the route to have the global community to involve in the discussion so that the Japan will realize or face the situation that the criticism does not come from Seoul, but from all over the world.
Right. We should be driven by logic, not emotions, especially when it's a very heated situation between very close neighbors. And when we talk about South Korea and Japan, we cannot leave out one of the two countries' closest allies, the United States.
Right.
They've not been very actively involved with this situation because they know it's sensitive. Meanwhile, the New York Times slammed Japan, saying Abe is emulating Trump's approach in creating a trade war against China.
Right. We jokingly said that Abe might have spent too much time with Trump because a lot of his actions has been Trumpian in nature. I think that's what's happening. I think Shinzo Abe, looking at the domestic situation, took the cue from Trump that it worked in the United States. So he's bringing in a lot of kind of a forced argument. Sometimes it looks petty, but if he thinks that if it achieves the purpose he needs, then he's taking a very utilitarian, an extreme utilitarian view of it.
So short-term gains, that's what he's going for at this moment. Taking
Right.
a page out of Trump's playbook, which might not actually translate properly to Japan's situation. The U.S. has been very careful with its words, trying to say they are concerned, but they do not say they want to jump in and play the role of mediator. Very unlike the United States. It shows how important this alliance is between the three sides. How likely is it that Washington will play the role of mediator soon?
Right. As you pointed out, the three-country alliance in this region is very important in that sense. The United States probably would be very unwilling and very reluctant to interfere with these two countries' dispute because any country that's resentful of the United States will be a bad news for the United States, consequently good news for China as the narrative goes. So I think that the United States will kind of stay put for a foreseeable future. But as we were talking about before, the ramification of the dispute between the two countries, if it's prolonged, that affects the global economy, and I think it'll affect the high-tech industries in the U.S. In the front part of it. So in that sense, America first kind of the spirit of Donald Trump would dictate that he will interfere, or he will make some noise about the resolution of these two, because if it starts to affect the high-tech industry and the Wall Street indices goes down, then it's a pretty bad news for Donald Trump, who himself is facing a crucial election next year.
It's going to be a matter of framing whether it's America takes action first or America concerned about situations first.
Right.
Well, it's when it comes to the three allies, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, they're closely knitted together in terms of security situation as well. And there are some experts who are saying this dispute and this friction might snowball into something that could affect the strategic alliance, security alliance between the three sides. How would that affect Washington's next move?
Right. The Donald Trump is obviously the Donald Trump's involvement in the North Korea talk is also part of it, because the North Korea situation can be well resolved if there is a credible and also well-oiled kind of alliance against that. I mean, UN sanction is one, U.S. sanction is one, but the Japan, Korea, and the United States on one side, and North Korea and China and possibly others on the other side is kind of forming a front line at this point. So any kind of the fissure, any kind of crack in any one side would be a sign of weakness in the negotiation table. I think that Donald Trump is well aware of that. Because of that, the stance in the Washington is to prevent that kind of noises coming out of this alliance. So not only the economic issues, but spilling over to the security issues, I think those two are at this point very closely related. So I think that Donald Trump, what he would say going forward would be measured in that sense. He will not only address the economic issues, but his remark will have implication to security measures and also North Korea situation.
Well, we've been at this topic for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, we have not seen positive developments since the point we started. Hopefully, it'll be different next time we sit down for talks. Professor Song Se-ran, thank you so much for coming in and making our program complete today.
My pleasure.
South Korea-Japan trade spat continues to escalate. Here's the latest development on that story. Let's roll the clip.
Britain's weekly magazine The Economist said the trade dispute between Seoul and Tokyo has Trumpian echoes with the potential to be as damaging as Washington's trade dispute with Europe and China. In an online post on Friday, the magazine drew parallels between Japan's latest export restrictions to South Korea and U.S. President Donald Trump's economic strategies, claiming Trump's model of abusing economic partners is spreading. The magazine said Japan's measures are self-harming as well as economically short-sighted and reckless. Saying that Korean companies are the most dominant memory chip manufacturers in the world, it said Japan's export restrictions would deal a big blow to the global supply chain. However, it stressed that it's not too late for the two countries to settle the dispute, while the economic fallout remains limited. Meanwhile, a Japanese expert also seems to be on the same line. In an article published at EE Times Japan, Takashi Yunogami, a semiconductor engineer turned consultant and an author on Japan's semiconductor industry, says Japan is digging its own grave with the latest export curbs.
Presidential National Security Advisor Kim Hyun-jong says Tokyo is clearly violating the WTO principles of free trade and international law through its unilateral export curbs, and once again called on Japan to retract the measures. Regarding top Japanese diplomat Taro Kono's remarks that Seoul is not abiding by a 1965 bilateral treaty, the top aide said such claims are incorrect.
We would like to emphasize that it was Japan which violated international law by committing crimes against humanity in the form of forced labor. This is what the Supreme Court of Korea pointed out.
Kim said South Korea had followed all standard procedures to resolve the issue of forced labor with Japan through regular diplomatic channels. The top aide also flatly rejected Japan's proposal for a third-party arbitration process for which it has set a July 18th deadline for Seoul to respond.
That's all we have for you today. Do tune in again next week, same time for a brand new episode of The Point World Affairs. Thank you so much for watching.